The leather bookmark lay on the carpet, 3 feet from the body, its corner bent, as though someone had gripped it too tightly before it fell. The rain outside had softened to a whisper against the mullioned windows, each drop finding its own path down glass that had watched over this library for 200 years. A constable stood near the door, his breathing careful and measured, as though the room itself demanded reverence. Or perhaps it was simply that death, even when it arrives quietly, commands a certain stillness. The scholar's spectacles rested on the reading table beside an open ledger, folded with deliberate care, their wire frames catching the lamplight in a way that seemed almost gentle. But the scholar himself had worn spectacles. Watson had seen the red marks on either side of his nose, where they had pressed into the skin for years. Someone had removed them after he died, folded them neatly, and placed them just so. Holmes stood in the center of the room, his tall frame casting a shadow that moved like a sundial across Persian rugs, worn soft by generations of footsteps. He had not yet touched anything. His eyes moved in that peculiar way they did when he was reading a space the way other men read books, left to right, top to bottom, with an occasional return to a passage that troubled him. Watson knew better than to speak during these moments. Outside, the storm that had raged through the evening had exhausted itself, leaving only the drip and sigh of water finding its way from gutters to earth, from leaf to stone. The smell of rain mingled with older scents. Beeswax candles burned down to stubs, the leather of 1,000 book spines, and something else. A faint chemical sweetness that might have been cologne, or might have been something applied to make one think of cologne. The library at Blackwell Manor occupied the eastern corner of the house, a room built during Elizabeth's reign, and modified over centuries into something both grand and peculiar. Shelves rose to a height of 12 feet on 3 walls, their wood dark with age and polish, bearing volumes in Latin and Greek, in French and German, in English both modern and antiquated. A rolling ladder of brass and oak stood against the northern wall, its wheels settled into grooves worn into the floor by decades of identical journeys. The fourth wall held the door, a single door, heavy oak reinforced with iron strapping, the kind of door that announced its opening and closing with authority. Beyond that door lay a corridor, and in that corridor, throughout the entirety of the previous evening, had stood either a footman or a guest, never fewer than 2 people within sight of the entrance, often 3 or 4. The windows, tall and narrow in the Tudor fashion, were barred on the outside with ironwork that had begun as decoration and ended as security. Each bar was as thick as a man's thumb, set deep into the stone, and between them a child could not have passed, let alone a grown person. The chimney, though substantial, rose straight and narrow, its flue designed for efficient draw rather than capacious passage. A man might get his arm up it, perhaps his head and shoulders if he were determined and slender, but no further. And in any case, the constable had already checked, finding it cold and undisturbed, its soot settled in patterns that spoke of weeks without fire. The ladder, Holmes said, his voice quiet enough that it seemed part of the room's natural sounds, the creak of old wood, the tick of the mantel clock, the settling of stone. He moved toward it with the careful attention of a man approaching a sleeping animal. Watson followed, his boots silent on the carpet, his medical bag still in hand, though he had already examined the body and found nothing that required his instruments. The scholar, his name had been Cornelius Ashford, though Watson found it difficult to think of the still form as anything but the scholar, had died of a blow to the back of the head, delivered with force but not frenzy. The wound was clean, single, efficient. Death would have followed within moments, perhaps within seconds. Holmes knelt beside the ladder, his long fingers hovering over one of the lower rungs, without quite touching it. "You see it, Watson?" Watson looked. The rung was polished, certainly, as were all the rungs, kept bright by the manor's servants. But this one caught the light differently, reflecting it in a way that suggested recent handling, the kind of handling that comes from gripping hard and pulling oneself upward quickly, perhaps without the usual care for balance or grace. The patina of careful maintenance had been interrupted by necessity. "Someone climbed in haste," Watson ventured. "Or descended in haste," Holmes replied, though the distinction may prove less important than the fact of haste itself. A man who uses a ladder in leisure leaves no mark. A man who uses it in urgency leaves this. He gestured, not at the rung itself, but at something Watson had not noticed, a faint scuff on the carpet beneath, where the ladder's wheel had caught and dragged, just slightly, creating a mark no larger than a shilling. The room had been locked from the inside. That was the crux of it, the impossible thing that had brought Holmes from London on a night when the trains were delayed by flooding, and the roads were rivers of mud. Lord Ashworth, the manor's owner and the host of the house party during which Cornelius Ashford had met his end, had explained it in a letter that trembled between pride in his home's security and horror at what that security implied. The door locked with a key from the inside, and the key had been found in Ashford's pocket after the body was discovered. The windows were barred. The chimney was impassable. The floor was solid stone beneath its carpets, and the ceiling showed no trap or opening. And yet, Cornelius Ashford, a scholar of medieval manuscripts who had come to Blackwell Manor to examine Lord Ashworth's collection, had died in this room while guests and servants stood watch at its only door. Watson moved to the window and looked out at the grounds, now emerging from darkness into the grey promise of dawn. The storm had been violent, one of those autumn tempests that seem to carry the weight of winter in their advance guard. Trees bent and dripped, their leaves stripped, and scattered across lawns that would take days to rake clean. In the distance, beyond the formal gardens, a stone folly rose from a copse of oaks, its columns pale against the dark wood. Closer, beneath the window itself, gravel paths showed the tracks of rain, but nothing else. No ladder marks, no footprints, no sign that anyone had approached from outside. "The bookmark," Holmes said, and Watson turned to find his friend crouched beside the small leather rectangle that had first caught Watson's attention. It was well made, the kind of thing a scholar might commission or receive as a gift. Tooled leather with a silk ribbon attached, suitable for marking one's place in valuable volumes. But it lay on the floor, not in a book, and its bent corner suggested it had been gripped, pulled, perhaps used as something other than its intended purpose. Holmes lifted it with the edge of his pencil, turning it in the lamplight. "Monogrammed," he observed. "C.A. our deceased friends. Initials. Yet the book from which it presumably fell." He stood and moved to the reading table, where several volumes lay open or stacked. bears no obvious mark of recent use in any place where this bookmark might logically have rested. Watson approached the table. The topmost book was a 14th century psalter, its vellum pages open to an illuminated initial that glowed even in the dim light. Beside it lay a ledger of more recent vintage, perhaps 50 years old, filled with careful entries in faded ink. A magnifying glass, a pair of white cotton gloves for handling delicate pages, and a notebook bearing Ashford's neat annotations completed the tableau. All spoke of methodical work, the kind of scholarship that moved at the pace of seasons rather than hours. He was systematic, Watson said, everything in its place. Except the bookmark. Holmes set it on the table with care, which suggests it wasn't he who removed it from its proper location. The body had been discovered at 11:30 the previous evening, when Lord Ashworth had finally insisted on checking the library, despite Ashford's request for privacy. The scholar had retired to his work at 8 o'clock, asking that he not be disturbed until midnight, when he planned to present his findings to the assembled house party. The request was not unusual. Ashford had made similar arrangements on each of the 3 previous evenings of his stay, emerging punctually to discuss his progress over brandy and conversation. But on this night, when Lord Ashworth knocked and received no answer, then knocked again with growing concern, then finally used his master key to unlock the door from the corridor side, he found Ashford on the floor, his life departed, and the library sealed around him like a tomb. Holmes moved along the bookshelves now, his eyes scanning not the spines, but the shelves themselves, the spaces between books, the surfaces behind them. Victorian libraries accumulated dust with the same inevitability that they accumulated knowledge, and the servants at Blackwell Manor, though diligent, could not reach every cranny in their weekly rounds. Where dust gathered, disturbance showed. "Here?" Holmes murmured, more to himself than to Watson. He had found something on a shelf at shoulder height, in a section devoted to architectural texts and county histories. A line in the dust, faint but definite, running horizontally for perhaps 6 inches. Watson joined him and saw it too, the mark of something moved, or something that had moved, interrupting the even grey film with a clean edge. A book removed, Watson suggested. Or a book that swung outward, Holmes replied, though that would be rather theatrical, would it not? Secret passages belong in sensation novels, not Oxfordshire manor houses. But his tone carried a note that Watson had learned to recognise, the sound of Holmes pretending disbelief while his mind raced ahead to confirmation. The mantel clock chimed the half-hour, its sound silver and clear in the stillness. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely, and in its absence, the world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for sunrise, for explanation, for release from the peculiar tension that accompanies unexplained death. A door opened somewhere in the house, and voices drifted up, servants beginning their morning routines, the machinery of a great household starting its daily cycle, despite tragedy, perhaps because of it, because routine is armour against chaos. Holmes straightened, his examination apparently complete for the moment. "The library will remain locked," he said to the constable, who had been standing with admirable patience throughout. "No one enters until I return. Lord Ashworth has been made aware." "Yes, sir. His lordship is most anxious to speak with you." "I imagine he is." Holmes moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to survey the room once more. Watson followed his gaze, trying to see what. Holmes saw the scattered puzzle pieces that would, in time, form a picture. The bookmark on the table, the polished ladder rung, the dust line on the shelf, the folded spectacles. Each was a word in a sentence Watson couldn't yet read. "They all watched the door," Holmes said quietly. "Every person in the corridor, every guest who passed, every servant who came and went. They watched the door, Watson, as though the door were the only thing worth watching." "But it was," Watson said. "It was the only way in or out." Holmes smiled, that slight, knowing expression that meant he had seen through to something essential. "Precisely, my dear fellow. It was the only way anyone thought to watch, and therein lies our first real clue. Not in what was observed, but in what was rendered invisible by observation elsewhere." They stepped into the corridor, and Holmes locked the door behind them with the key Lord Ashworth had provided. The house was stirring now, dawnlight beginning to filter through windows, the storm's violence replaced by its aftermath, dripping, settling, the slow return to order. Somewhere below, Watson could smell coffee brewing, bread baking, the ordinary miracles of kitchen routine. But here, in the corridor outside the library with one door, the extraordinary persisted, a death without entry, a locked room with an answer that Holmes had already, Watson suspected, begun to unravel. The morning lay ahead, full of questions to be asked, witnesses to be interviewed, and somewhere in the architecture of this old house, a truth waiting to be revealed. The fog had settled over Blackwell Manor by the time Holmes and Watson descended to breakfast, moving through the grounds like something alive and patient, softening the edges of topiary and turning the distant folly into a ghost of itself. It was the kind of fog that belonged to Oxfordshire autumns, thicker than London's smoke-tinged variety, smelling of wet earth and rotting leaves, and the particular dampness that comes from land that has known human cultivation for 1,000 years. Through the dining-room windows, Watson could see it pressing against the glass, obscuring everything beyond 20 feet, as though the house had been lifted during the night and set down in some liminal space between earth and sky. The dining-room itself fought back against the grey outside with warmth and light, a fire in the marble hearth, silver chafing dishes reflecting the flames, the rich smell of kedgeree and bacon, coffee and toast. But the guests gathered around the table ate with the mechanical motions of people performing a ritual they no longer believed in. Conversation, when it occurred, came in whispers and fragments, dying away like ripples on a pond. Lord Ashworth rose as Holmes entered, his face showing the particular exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from sleeping badly, startling awake at every creak and settling of an old house. He was a man in his middle 50s, with the build of someone who had been athletic in youth, and had settled into comfortable prosperity without quite surrendering to it entirely. His hands, Watson noticed, trembled slightly as he gestured toward the sideboard. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, please help yourselves. I've asked everyone to remain available for your inquiries. They've all been most cooperative." The pause before the last word suggested that cooperation had required effort, perhaps persuasion, possibly even the veiled threat of scandal should anyone attempt to leave before the matter was resolved. Holmes filled a plate with the absent attention of a man whose mind was elsewhere, then took a seat that allowed him to observe the assembled company. Watson, knowing his role, positioned himself where he could watch Holmes watch others. A second set of eyes recording different details. The medical man's attention to physiology and stress, where Holmes saw motive and deception. There were 7 guests beyond Holmes and Watson themselves. At the head of the table sat Lady Ashworth, a woman of striking composure despite circumstances, her mourning black already donned, though propriety might have allowed her another day before assuming it. She had not known Cornelius Ashford well, Watson learned later, but death in one's home demanded certain observances regardless of personal acquaintance. Her hands remained still as she took tea, and her eyes, when they met Watson's, were clear and direct. To her right sat Dr. Marcus Fielding, a scholar of medieval literature from Oxford, perhaps 40 years old, with the soft hands and stooped shoulders of a man who had spent his life among books rather than sports or outdoor pursuits. He had been Ashford's colleague, though the word rival might have been more accurate, as Holmes would discover. Fielding pushed food around his plate without eating, his gaze fixed on something in the middle distance that only he could see. Across from Fielding, Miss Evelyn Casterbrook picked at a piece of toast with bird-like delicacy. She was young, perhaps 25, employed as an archivist by the British Museum, and had come to Blackwell Manor at Ashford's request to assist with examining Lord Ashworth's collection. Her eyes were red-rimmed, whether from grief or lack of sleep Watson could not determine, and she kept her hands in her lap, except when absolutely necessary to manage her teacup. Beside her sat Mr. Reginald Thorne, the patron whose presence gave the house party its ostensible purpose. He was a wealthy collector, self-made in trade, who had spent the last decade acquiring a reputation as a scholar through the simple expedient of purchasing scholarship, funding expeditions, bankrolling publications, lending his name to discoveries made by others. He was perhaps 60, with the kind of face that suggested good living and few regrets, though this morning the good living sat uneasily, and something that might have been regret flickered behind his eyes. The Reverend Samuel Blackwood occupied the chair nearest the fire, his clerical collar stark against his black coat. He was the manor's parish priest, invited to the house party to provide spiritual guidance during what Lord Ashworth had hoped would be a celebration of scholarship rather than a meditation on mortality. He ate steadily, methodically, as though he had seen death often enough that it no longer disturbed his appetite. Rounding out the company were Sir Geoffrey Milbank and his wife, Lady Caroline. Sir Geoffrey was a magistrate, a fortunate circumstance that had allowed Lord Ashworth to contain the matter within the house, rather than involving the county constabulary immediately. He sat with the bearing of a man accustomed to authority, though Watson noted that his gaze kept drifting to Holmes, with something between relief and resentment. Relief that someone of Holmes's reputation had taken the matter in hand, resentment that his own authority had been so readily set aside. Lady Caroline was the only person at the table who seemed genuinely unaffected by the tragedy, though Watson suspected this was less callousness than a determined effort to maintain normalcy. She commented on the fog, on the quality of the marmalade, on a letter she had received from a cousin in Bath, as though murder had not occurred 20 feet above their heads. Holmes set down his coffee cup with a soft click against the saucer. "I wonder if I might impose upon you all for a few moments of your time this morning. Separately, if you would be so kind. The library corridor, I think, would be suitable. close enough to the scene to refresh memory, far enough for comfort. "Surely you don't suspect one of us," Sir Geoffrey said, his tone suggesting that suspecting guests at a house party was simply not done, regardless of circumstances. "I suspect everyone of something," Holmes replied mildly, "though often it is merely of knowing more than they realize they know. Dr. Fielding, might I begin with you?" The corridor outside the library was darker than the dining room, lit only by windows at either end and the grey light they admitted. The fog pressed against the glass like something seeking entrance, and the gas lamps, though turned low, created more shadow than illumination. Holmes positioned himself with his back to the library door, while Watson took a seat on a bench that had probably been placed there a century ago for the convenience of servants waiting to be summoned. Dr. Fielding arrived within moments, his scholar's stoop more pronounced now that he was removed from the relative safety of numbers. He carried himself like a man approaching an examination he knew he was unprepared for. "You were colleagues," Holmes began. "You and Mr. Ashford." "Yes. For nearly 15 years. We studied together at Cambridge, took our positions at Oxford within a year of each other." Fielding's voice was soft, cultured, with the particular precision of someone who spent his days parsing medieval Latin and Middle English. "And your relationship was cordial?" A pause, long enough to be significant. "We disagreed on matters of interpretation, as scholars do." "Disagreed strongly?" "Mr. Holmes, Cornelius could be dogmatic. He believed his methods were the only valid approach to textual analysis. I found his certainty exhausting." Fielding's hands moved as he spoke, sketching small shapes in the air, as though diagramming arguments. "But I did not kill him over a footnote, if that's what you're suggesting." Holmes smiled slightly. "Where were you between 8 o'clock and 11:30 yesterday evening?" "In the drawing-room until 9 with everyone else, then in the billiard-room with Sir Geoffrey and Mr. Thorne until perhaps 10:30. Then in my room reading. I heard nothing unusual." "Did you see anyone in this corridor during the evening?" "Servants, of course. The footman, Thomas, I believe. His name is Kion, was stationed here from 8 onward, as Lord Ashworth had requested, ensuring Cornelius's privacy." The last words carried a note of something, irony, perhaps, or bitterness at privacy so thoroughly enforced it had become a tomb. Holmes made a note in the small book he carried. What was Mr. Ashford examining in Lord Ashworth's collection? A psalter, 14th century, possibly earlier, and a manuscript that Mr. Thorne had recently acquired and donated to the collection. A work allegedly by Geoffrey of Monmouth, though Cornelius had doubts about its provenance. What sort of doubts? Fielding's expression shifted, becoming almost eager. He believed it was a forgery. 19th century, possibly even more recent. He had found inconsistencies in the Latin, anachronisms in the references. He was planning to present his findings last night, at midnight. He was going to... Fielding stopped, awareness dawning. He was going to expose it, publicly, in front of Mr. Thorne and Lord Ashworth, and all of us. And Mr. Thorne had paid handsomely for this manuscript, I imagine. A fortune, and his reputation rested on it. He had published a monograph, claimed it was one of the great discoveries of the age. Fielding's voice dropped. Cornelius was going to destroy him. Holmes dismissed Fielding and summoned Miss Casterbrook next. She entered the corridor, with the hesitant steps of someone walking into a room where she expected to be scolded, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes downcast. Watson found himself wanting to offer her tea, to suggest she sit, to do something to ease the evident distress that radiated from her like cold from stone. "You worked with Mr. Ashford," Holmes said gently. "Yes, sir, for 3 years, as his research assistant initially, and then at the museum." Her voice was barely audible, each word emerging with effort. "And yesterday evening? I was in the library with him until 7:30, helping with measurements and photographs of the Psalter. Then he asked me to leave, so he could work undisturbed. He said he needed to prepare his presentation carefully, that what he had to reveal would be uncomfortable for some people." "Did he seem worried? Afraid?" She looked up for the first time, meeting Holmes's gaze. He seemed exhilarated, the way he always did when he had solved a puzzle. He was not a kind man, Mr. Holmes, but he was brilliant, and he loved being right, more than he feared being wrong. "Where did you go after leaving the library?" "To my room. I have a headache that had been building all day. Lady Ashworth sent up a tonic, and I took it and lay down. I fell asleep and didn't wake until the commotion began, when Lord Ashworth discovered—" She stopped, her composure fracturing. "I should have stayed. I should have been there. Perhaps if someone had been with him, then there would likely be 2 deaths instead of 1, Holmes said, not unkindly. "You were not responsible for his safety, Miss Casterbrook." But Watson saw in her eyes that she did not believe him, that she would carry the weight of those hours for a long time, the guilt of sleep, while someone she had worked beside for 3 years was dying 30 feet away. The interview with Mr. Thorne was different in character, less grief, more defensiveness, the manner of a man who had spent his life in negotiation and saw this as simply another transaction to be managed. He stood rather than sat, his hands in his pockets, his posture suggesting he was granting Holmes a favour by his presence. "The manuscript was genuine," he said, before Holmes could ask a question. "Authenticated by 3 separate experts before I acquired it. Cornelius was jealous, nothing more. He couldn't bear that someone outside the academy had made such a discovery. And yet he found evidence of forgery. He found what he wanted to find. Scholars do that, Mr. Holmes. They construct elaborate arguments to support their prejudices." Thorne's face had reddened slightly, whether from anger or the warmth of the corridor Watson could not say. "Where were you last evening?" "Drawing room until 9, billiard room until 10:30, as Dr. Fielding already told you, I'm sure. Then to my room. I was tired. These country house parties are exhausting when one reaches my age." "Did you know what Mr. Ashford planned to announce?" A pause. I suspected. He had been asking pointed questions, making insinuations, but I never imagined he would be so ungentlemanly as to make accusations in public. Holmes tilted his head slightly. "More ungentlemanly than murder?" "I did not murder him." Thorne's voice was flat, controlled. "I had no opportunity. The door was watched. The room was sealed. Whatever happened to Cornelius Ashford, I had no hand in it." The Reverend Blackwood was next, and he brought with him the smell of pipe tobacco and the calm that comes from years of sitting with the dying and bereaved. He answered Holmes's questions with straightforward simplicity. He had been in the drawing-room until 11, then retired to his room to prepare Sunday's sermon. He had heard nothing, seen nothing unusual. He had prayed for Mr. Ashford's soul when he learned of the death. and he would pray for his killer's repentance when that person was discovered. Sir Geoffrey and Lady Caroline were interviewed together at Lady Caroline's insistence. They had been in the drawing-room until 10:30, visible to multiple witnesses, then had retired together to their room. Sir Geoffrey's testimony was crisp, factual, the testimony of a man accustomed to giving evidence. Lady Caroline's was more effusive, including details about the evening's conversation, the card games, who had drunk too much port, and who had complained of the weather. Finally, Holmes spoke with Lord Ashworth himself, and here Watson saw his friend's manner shift slightly, becoming more deferential, though no less penetrating. "The house has a complex history," Holmes said. "Built when?" "The oldest parts date to Elizabeth's reign. 1580s, we believe. The library wing was added then. The family has maintained records, architectural drawings. They're in the estate office if you wish to see them." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "I would very much wish to see them, this afternoon, if possible." "Of course, whatever you need." Lord Ashworth's relief was palpable. Action, any action, was preferable to waiting. "Mr. Holmes, I must ask, do you believe it was one of them? One of my guests?" "I believe," Holmes said carefully, "that someone killed Cornelius Ashford in a locked room, and I believe that impossibility is simply possibility we have not yet understood. The door was watched. But a house this old has more ways in and out than doors, Lord Ashworth. It remembers eras when privacy had different meanings, when safety required secrets. Outside, the fog was lifting, revealing grounds that glistened with moisture, trees dripping their stored rain onto gravel and grass. Watson stood at the window and watched a gardener wheeling a barrow full of broken branches, the ordinary work of the world continuing despite death, because of death, in defiance of it. Holmes joined him at the window. "You see it, Watson." "I see a house full of people with motives," Watson replied. "Any of them might have wanted Ashford silenced, but none of them could have done it." "Unless they found what everyone else had forgotten," Holmes said softly. "The architect's intention, buried under centuries of habit. This afternoon we shall see what Lord Ashworth's drawings reveal. But I believe we already know, you and I. We simply need confirmation." Watson looked at his friend's profile, saw the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, and knew that Holmes had indeed already solved it. The rest was merely demonstration. The estate office occupied a corner of Blackwell Manor that felt forgotten by time, as though the centuries had accumulated here more thickly than elsewhere in the house. It was a small room tucked behind the main staircase, with a single window that looked out onto a courtyard where kitchen gardens had once flourished and now existed as orderly beds of herbs maintained more from habit than necessity. The air inside smelled of old paper and linseed oil, of dust that had settled and been disturbed and settled again in rhythms measured by generations rather than seasons. Lord Ashworth led Holmes and Watson through a door that required 2 hands to open, its hinges protesting with a sound like a sigh. Inside, wooden filing cabinets lined 3 walls, their drawers labelled in fading ink with categories that spoke of an estate's concerns across 400 years. Tenancies, repairs, boundaries, household accounts, legal matters. A large table dominated the centre of the room, its surface scarred by centuries of use, ink stains and candle wax, and the circular marks left by countless cups of tea forming a palimpsest of administrative labour. "The architectural drawings are here," Lord Ashworth said, moving to a wide, flat cabinet against the far wall. "My grandfather had them consolidated and preserved. Before that, they were scattered throughout the house, rolled up in attics and tucked into cupboards. Some are quite beautiful, works of art in themselves." He pulled open a drawer and lifted out a portfolio bound in leather, its surface cracked with age but still intact. Inside, between sheets of tissue paper, lay the history of Blackwell Manor rendered in ink and careful measurement. Holmes spread the first drawing on the table with the reverence Watson usually associated with handling ancient manuscripts in museums. The earliest drawing showed the original manor house as it had existed in 1583, a modest structure by later standards, built in the shape of an E, that letter being a compliment to the reigning queen and a common architectural choice of the eras. The library wing extended from the eastern arm of the E, a single room that would have been grand for its time, designed to house not just books, but the entire intellectual life of a household, for whom learning was both luxury and duty. Watson leaned over Holmes's shoulder, studying the precise lines and annotations. The drawing showed the library from above, its dimensions noted in feet and inches that felt both familiar and strange. The measurements were English, but the hand that wrote them had formed numbers in a style that belonged to a different century's education. The door was marked clearly, positioned in the western wall. The windows were shown as narrow slots in the southern and eastern walls, their placement designed to capture morning and afternoon light while maintaining the wall's defensive strength. "You see it?" Holmes murmured, his finger tracing a line along the northern wall. Watson looked more closely. The northern wall, which, in the current library, was covered entirely with bookshelves, showed something in the original drawing, a small notation, barely visible, in Latin. He squinted, making out the words, "Camera absconsa, pro tempore necessitatis." A hidden chamber for times of necessity, Watson translated slowly, his schoolboy Latin returning with effort. "A priest hole," Lord Ashworth said, his voice carrying surprise and something else, a note of wonder that such a thing had existed in his house without his knowledge. "Of course, my ancestors were Catholic, or Catholic sympathetic, at least, during Elizabeth's reign. Many houses from that era have them, but I was told all of ours had been sealed or converted to ordinary storage decades ago." Holmes was already pulling out more drawings, spreading them across the table in chronological sequence. The story they told was one of modification and forgetting. The way buildings accumulate changes the way rivers accumulate silt, each layer obscuring what lay beneath. In 1620, the library had been expanded, new shelving added. In 1680, the windows had been enlarged, the bars added for security. In 1750, the room had been refurbished entirely, panelled in mahogany, the shelves rebuilt to accommodate larger volumes, and the growing collection of a family whose fortunes had risen with trade and judicious marriages. But nowhere in the later drawings was the priest hole mentioned. It had been built, and then it had been forgotten, or perhaps deliberately obscured, the way Catholic families had learned to forget their Catholicism when it became dangerous to remember, the way architectural secrets became simply walls when the need for them had passed. "Where does it lead?" Watson asked, though he thought he already knew. Holmes was studying a drawing from 1585, added after the original construction, showing modifications to the lower floors. His finger traced a line from the priest hole downward, through the floor, into the spaces below. To the wine cellar, unless I'm mistaken. And from the wine cellar, he looked at Lord Ashworth. To the servant corridors, Lord Ashworth finished, understanding dawning. And from there to 6 exits, the kitchen door, the scullery, the coal cellar. Good God, it's been there all along. A passage that would let someone enter and leave the library without ever approaching the main door. Holmes rolled up the drawings carefully, his movements precise. I should like to see the library again. Specifically, I should like to examine the northern wall with these drawings in mind, and then I should like to see your wine cellar, Lord Ashworth, and trace the path from one to the other. The fog had lifted entirely by the time they returned to the library corridor, burned away by a pale sun that seemed uncertain of its welcome. The constable still stood at the door, looking grateful for the interruption to his monotonous duty. Holmes unlocked the door and entered, moving immediately to the northern wall where he had noticed the dust disturbance that morning. The bookshelves here held architectural texts, county histories, volumes of sermons and theological disputes, the kind of books that were required for completeness rather than frequent consultation. Holmes ran his hand along the spines, his touch light, barely disturbing them. Watson watched him work, noting how his friend's attention had sharpened, the way it did when theory was approaching confirmation. "The ladder," Holmes said, and the constable, understanding, rolled it along its brass track until it stood before the section Holmes indicated. Holmes climbed 3 rungs, then 4, bringing himself level with the shelf at shoulder height where the dust had been disturbed. He pulled out books one at a time, examining their spines, setting them on the floor with care. Watson counted. 7 books removed, and then Holmes paused, his hand resting on the spine of an 8th. It was a large folio, bound in brown calf leather, titled in gold, The History and Antiquities of Oxfordshire, Volume 2. "This one," Holmes said. "You'll notice it's backward." Watson looked more closely. The spine indeed faced outward, but the book itself was reversed on the shelf, its foredge where its spine should be, as though someone had replaced it in haste, without attention to orientation. Holmes gripped it carefully and pulled. The book moved perhaps 3 inches, then stopped, catching on something. Holmes pulled harder, and there was a soft click, the sound of metal releasing from metal, a mechanism engaging that had not engaged in decades, perhaps centuries. And then, with a groan of wood moving against wood, the entire section of shelving, perhaps 4 feet wide and 8 feet tall, swung slowly inward, revealing darkness beyond. Lord Ashworth made a sound between a gasp and a laugh. Extraordinary. The priest hole was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to stand comfortably, perhaps 3 feet deep. The walls were stone, rough and unfinished, and the air that emerged carried the smell of earth and age and something else, recent disturbance, the scent of wool and sweat and fear, perhaps left by someone who had passed through in haste. The floor showed scuff marks in the dust, the tracks of boots moving quickly, and a single item lay in the corner. A silk ribbon, dark blue, the kind used as a bookmark or to tie documents together. Holmes picked it up carefully, holding it to the light. "Miss Casterbrook's, I believe. I noticed she wore such ribbons in her hair at breakfast." "But she said she left at 7:30, Watson protested, "and remained in her room all evening. What she said and what occurred may be different things, Holmes replied. Or the ribbon may have been here longer than we assume. We shall see. He pocketed it and turned his attention to the passage itself. Stone steps descended into darkness, worn smooth by centuries of careful feet. Priests, climbing to hiding during raids, families visiting their concealed chaplains, servants perhaps using the passage for purposes that had nothing to do with religion, and everything to do with the shortcuts servants always find in great houses. Holmes produced a candle from his pocket and lit it, the flame casting enormous shadows that danced on the walls like memories of those who had passed this way before. They descended single file. Holmes first, then Watson, then Lord Ashworth, who breathed heavily behind them. Whether from exertion or excitement Watson could not determine. The steps were steep and turning, spiralling down through the house's structure, and Watson counted 23 before they reached level ground again. They emerged into a small chamber, perhaps 6 feet square, with walls of the same rough stone. 3 passages led from it, each no more than 4 feet high, requiring them to stoop. "The central one," Holmes said, his voice echoing oddly in the confined space. "See how the dust is disturbed. Someone has passed through recently. Within the last day, certainly." They followed it, bent nearly double, Watson feeling the press of stone above and around him, the weight of the house bearing down in a way that made breathing feel like work. The passage smelled of wine and damp stone, and after perhaps 30 feet, it opened into a larger space that Watson recognized immediately as the wine cellar, though they had entered it from an angle he had not known existed. Racks of bottles stretched away into darkness, ordered by vintage and region in the way of cellars that took their responsibilities seriously. The ceiling here was vaulted, brick rather than stone, and high enough to stand upright in comfort. But what drew Watson's attention was the far wall, where a door stood slightly ajar, showing a glimpse of corridor beyond. A servant corridor, plain and utilitarian, lit by small windows that opened at ground level. Holmes moved to the door and examined its frame carefully. No lock on this side. It opens freely, and from this corridor one could reach. He stepped through, and Watson followed, finding themselves in a passage that ran the length of the house's eastern wing. Doors opened off it at regular intervals, to the kitchen, to the scullery, to store rooms and pantries. At the far end, perhaps 60 feet away, morning light showed through an open doorway that led to the kitchen gardens, and, beyond them, to the wider grounds. Anyone familiar with the house's service areas could enter through the kitchen door, pass along this corridor, through the wine cellar, up through the priest hole, and emerge in the library without ever approaching the main door, Holmes said. And after completing whatever business brought them there, they could reverse the journey, pulling the shelf closed behind them from the inside. There's a handle, you see, just there, and leave the library apparently sealed, locked from within, impossible to enter or exit. Lord Ashworth leaned against the corridor wall, his face pale. But who would know of this passage? Even I didn't know it existed until today. Someone who had studied your house's history, Holmes said. Someone who had access to those architectural drawings, or to family papers that mentioned the priest hole, or who had simply explored thoroughly, the way curious people do in old houses. Someone who understood that the Victorian obsession with cataloguing and preserving had inadvertently preserved knowledge that was meant to be forgotten. Watson thought of the guests assembled at breakfast, each with their own relationship to scholarship, to history, to the careful examination of documents and the patient unraveling of mysteries. Any of them might have found the reference, might have traced the passage, might have realized what opportunity it presented. But why? Lord Ashworth asked. Why kill Cornelius in such an elaborate fashion? Because the manner of death serves the murderer's purpose, Holmes replied. A locked room is not just a puzzle, Lord Ashworth. It is a message. It says this death is impossible. Therefore, it is not murder. Therefore, look elsewhere for explanations. Ghosts, perhaps, curses, the supernatural. Anything but the methodical application of architectural knowledge and careful timing. They stood in the servant corridor, the three of them, while around them the house continued its daily life. Footsteps above, voices in the distance, the clatter of pots from the kitchen. The secret had been revealed, the impossible made possible, but the question of who remained, and the question of why, and these questions, Watson knew, would require different tools than candlelight and old drawings. They would require understanding what Cornelius Ashford had discovered about Mr. Thorne's manuscript, and what that discovery was worth. In money? In reputation? In the kind of desperation that turns scholars into murderers and libraries into tombs. Holmes led them back through the passage, up the stone steps, into the library, where morning light now streamed through the barred windows, making the room seem almost cheerful despite the memory of death it held. He closed the secret shelf carefully, demonstrating how the mechanism worked, how the book spine served as both latch and lock, how centuries of craftsmanship had created something that functioned as smoothly now as when it was first built. "We know the how," Holmes said quietly. "Now we must prove the who and establish the why. And for that, Lord Ashworth, I shall need to examine Mr. Thorne's manuscript, the one Ashford believed to be forged. I shall need to see what was worth killing for." The manuscript rested in a specially constructed case in Lord Ashworth's private study, a room smaller and more intimate than the library, lined with first editions and family papers, smelling of leather, and the particular mustiness that comes from documents kept in careful darkness. The case itself was lined with velvet, dark green, and the manuscript within lay open to its first page, the vellum still pale after 8 centuries. Or so Mr. Thorne had claimed when he donated it to Lord Ashworth's collection with great ceremony 6 months prior. Holmes stood before it without touching, his hands clasped behind his back, his head tilted in the attitude Watson recognized as intense concentration. The afternoon light through the study window fell across the manuscript's surface, illuminating the careful Latin script, the decorated initial that began the text, the marginal notes in a different hand that spoke of later readers, later scholars, later centuries building their understanding atop older foundations. "Geoffrey of Monmouth," Lord Ashworth said quietly, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the manuscript itself. Or so Mr. Thorne believed, a previously unknown work on the legends of King Arthur, written perhaps in 1136, possibly earlier. If genuine, it would have been extraordinary, worth not just money, but academic immortality. Thorne would have gone down in history as the man who found Geoffrey's lost masterwork. And if false, Watson asked, then he would be known as either a fool or a fraud, depending on whether one believed he was deceived or complicit in the deception. Lord Ashworth moved to his desk and retrieved a folder, its contents bulging with papers. "These are Cornelius's notes. Miss Casterbrook brought them to me this morning. She found them in his room while packing his belongings. She thought you should see them before anyone else." Holmes took the folder with the careful attention of a man handling evidence, which Watson supposed was precisely what these papers were. He spread them on a reading table, and Watson joined him, looking over his shoulder at Ashford's precise handwriting, the careful annotations, the building argument that read like a prosecution's case. The first document was a letter, sealed with wax that showed a crack down its centre, recently opened, the wax still showing the sharp edge of the knife that had sliced it. Holmes held it to the light, examining the seal itself, noting something that made his eyebrows rise slightly before he unfolded the paper within. The letter was addressed to Ashford, dated 3 weeks prior, and signed with initials Watson recognized, E.C. Miss Evelyn Casterbrook. The handwriting matched the ribbon found in the priest hole, that same careful, feminine script. Holmes read aloud. "Dear Cornelius, I have completed the ink analysis you requested. The results are conclusive. The iron gall ink used in the manuscript contains Prussian blue, a pigment not synthesized until 1706. This places the earliest possible creation date at least 5.5 centuries after Geoffrey of Monmouth's death. I have triple-checked the findings. There is no error. The manuscript is certainly forgery, and a relatively recent one at that. What should I do with this information? I await your instruction. E.C." Watson felt something cold settle in his chest. She knew. Miss Casterbrook knew it was forged, and she told Ashford weeks ago. She was the one who proved it, Holmes corrected. Ashford suspected, but he needed scientific confirmation. Chemical analysis doesn't lie, Watson. Whatever story the manuscript told, whatever aged appearance it had been given, the ink gave it away. Prussian blue, the painter's pigment, discovered accidentally by a German colour maker. Beautiful in landscapes, fatal in forgeries. Lord Ashworth had gone very pale. Mr. Thorne paid £40,000 for that manuscript. He donated it to my collection with conditions, that his name be associated with it permanently, that any publications credit him as the discoverer, that the manuscript remain here at Blackwell Manor, where it could be studied and admired. He built his entire reputation on this discovery. And Cornelius Ashford was about to destroy that reputation in front of witnesses, Holmes said. In front of you, in front of Sir Geoffrey the magistrate, in front of Dr. Fielding and the Reverend Blackwood, and everyone assembled for what was meant to be a celebration of scholarship. Ashford was not simply going to publish a paper arguing for forgery. He was going to demonstrate it, publicly, irrefutably, with chemical evidence that could not be disputed. Watson moved to the manuscript case, looking down at the carefully wrought letters, the decorated margins, the appearance of great age. "It's beautiful," he said. "Whoever made it was an artist." "Indeed, and therein lies part of the tragedy." Holmes joined him at the case. "This is not crude work, Watson. This was done by someone with genuine knowledge, genuine skill, someone who understood medieval Latin, who could mimic the handwriting style, who knew how to prepare vellum and mix inks, or thought they knew how to mix inks. They made one mistake, one chemical anachronism, and that mistake was going to cost someone everything." He returned to Ashford's notes, rifling through pages of careful observation, linguistic analysis, Historical comparison. Ashford had been thorough as one would need to be when accusing a wealthy patron of possessing and promoting a forgery. There were photographs of the manuscript taken at different angles, measurements of margins and line spacing, comparisons with authenticated Geoffrey of Monmouth texts held in Oxford and Cambridge. And everywhere, throughout the notes, the recurring question: was Thorne deceived, or was he the deceiver? Holmes found the page where Ashford had addressed this question directly, his handwriting here less steady, as though the implications troubled him. The provenance Thorne provides is deliberately vague. A monastery in Normandy, now destroyed, records lost in fire. Convenient. The dealer, who sold it to him, has since died, taking any testimony to his grave. Convenient again. Yet Thorne's enthusiasm seems genuine, his belief in the manuscript's authenticity apparently sincere. Is he a consummate actor, or has he been the victim of an elaborate deception? If the latter, then the forger has committed a cruel crime against scholarship, but Thorne himself is blameless. If the former, then Thorne has perpetrated fraud on a grand scale, deceiving collectors, museums, and the public. I am inclined to believe he was deceived. His knowledge of medieval manuscripts is sufficient to appreciate their value, but not sufficient to detect sophisticated forgery. The true criminal remains unknown, perhaps laughing at Thorne's unwitting complicity. But whether victim or villain, Thorne's reputation will not survive this revelation. That seems almost unjust, yet truth demands it. He pitied him, Watson said. Ashford pitied Thorne, even as he prepared to destroy him. Pity does not preclude action, Holmes replied. Ashford was a scholar first. Truth was his loyalty. If Thorne suffered in pursuit of truth, that was regrettable, but necessary. Lord Ashworth moved to the window, looking out at grounds where afternoon was sliding toward evening, shadows lengthening across lawns still damp from the previous night's storm. So Thorne had motive. £40,000 lost. His reputation in ruins, his name forever associated with fraud, whether he was complicit or merely foolish. That's motive enough for murder, surely. Motive certainly, Holmes agreed, but also opportunity. Thorne claimed he was in his room from 10:30 onward, but his room is in the eastern wing, is it not? The same wing where the servant corridors run. He could have slipped out, made his way to the wine cellar, up through the priest hole, into the library through the hidden passage. If he had studied the house's history, and a collector like Thorne would surely have examined Lord Ashworth's architectural records when evaluating whether to donate such a valuable manuscript to the collection, he might well have discovered the priest hole's existence. Watson thought back to breakfast, to Thorne's defensiveness, his insistence that the manuscript was genuine, his anger at Ashford's jealousy. The man had been frightened, Watson realized now. Not just angry, but frightened, the way men are when they see their lives collapsing around them. "We should speak with Miss Casterbrook again," Holmes said. "She was the one who performed the analysis, who wrote that letter. She would have known how devastating her findings would be to Thorne. And her ribbon was found in the priest hole, suggesting she knew about the passage, perhaps had used it herself." They found Miss Casterbrook in the conservatory, a glass-walled room at the manor's southern end, where winter plants survived in humid warmth, their leaves glistening with moisture, the air thick with the smell of earth and growth. She sat on an iron bench among the ferns, a book unopened in her lap, her face turned toward the glass as though seeking something beyond the panes that she could not find within the house. She rose when Holmes entered, her manner composed, but fragile, like porcelain that had been cracked and carefully glued. "Mr. Holmes, you've seen Cornelius's notes, including your letter about the ink analysis?" Holmes's voice was gentle, but Watson knew that gentleness was tactical, designed to lower defences. "When did you discover the priest hole, Miss Casterbrook?" She blinked, surprise breaking through her composure. "How did you—" She stopped, understanding. "My ribbon. I lost it 2 days ago. I thought it had fallen somewhere in the house. I've been looking for it." "You lost it in the priest hole, which means you were there 2 days ago, before Ashford's death. Were you exploring?" She sat back down, her hands folding in her lap, with the careful precision of someone trying to maintain control. "I found a reference in the architectural records. I had gone to the estate office to look for information about the library's original construction. Cornelius had asked me to research it. And I found the drawings, the notation about the hidden chamber. I was curious. I wanted to see if it still existed, if it was still accessible." "And you discovered it was?" "Yes. The mechanism with the book spine. It took me an hour to find the right book, but I finally did. I opened the passage and explored it. Down to the wine cellar, through to the servant corridors. It was like discovering a secret world hidden inside the house. A world that had been forgotten." Her voice carried wonder despite the circumstances, the scholar's delight in discovery. "I didn't tell anyone. I thought Cornelius would want to see it himself, to document it properly. I was going to show him after his presentation." "Did you tell anyone else about the passage?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation Watson saw the answer before she spoke it. "Mr. Thorne saw me coming out of the wine cellar, the day I explored. He asked what I had been doing down there, and I told him. I was excited, Mr. Holmes. I didn't think about what it might mean. I just wanted to share the discovery with someone." Holmes was very still. "You told Thorne about the priest hole, about how it connected to the library, 2 days before Cornelius Ashford was found dead in that library. I didn't think—" her voice broke. "I didn't imagine he would. Mr. Holmes, I gave a murderer his method. I showed him how to do it." Watson moved to sit beside her, his medical instincts overriding his role as observer. "You couldn't have known what he intended. I knew Cornelius was going to expose the manuscript as forged. I knew Thorne would be ruined. I knew he had everything to lose. And I told him about a secret passage that would let him reach Cornelius without being seen." She looked at Holmes with eyes that begged for absolution or accusation. Watson wasn't sure which. "Does that make me guilty too?" "It makes you human," Holmes said quietly. "Guilty of enthusiasm, perhaps, of trusting too easily. But not of murder, Miss Casterbrook. That crime belongs to whoever struck the blow." But Watson saw in Holmes's face what he did not say, that information could be as deadly as a weapon, that knowledge shared innocently could be used for terrible purposes, that the brilliant young archivist would carry the weight of that ribbon in the priest hole for the rest of her life. They left her among the ferns, her book still unopened, her face turned again to glass that showed only her own reflection and the darkening grounds beyond. "Thorne knew about the passage," Watson said as they walked back through the house. "He had method and motive. Surely that's enough." "Enough for suspicion," Holmes replied. "Not yet enough for proof. We know he could have done it. We must now demonstrate that he did. The evening had settled over Blackwell Manor with the particular heaviness that comes after revelation, when the air itself seems weighted with knowledge that cannot be unlearned. Holmes stood in the library once more, the lamps turned low, casting shadows that moved like living things across the spines of books. Watson watched from the doorway as his friend moved along the northern wall, his fingers trailing across leather bindings, his attention focused on something Watson could not yet perceive. "You said they all watched the door," Watson ventured, "that watching the door made them blind to everything else." "Precisely." Holmes pulled the folio volume, The History and Antiquities of Oxfordshire, Volume 2, and the shelf swung inward with that same groaning protest, revealing darkness beyond. Social conditioning is as powerful as any lock, Watson, more powerful in some ways, because we do not recognize it as constraint. A Victorian household operates on invisible rules. Certain people use certain doors, certain spaces belong to certain classes. The servants' corridors might as well be in another country for all the attention the gentry pay them. He lit a candle and stepped into the priest hole, gesturing for Watson to follow. The space felt even smaller, with 2 men occupying it, the walls pressing close, the air stale and cold. Holmes knelt, examining the floor more carefully than he had during their first exploration. His candle held low, so the light raked across the stone at an angle. "Here," he said, his voice echoing oddly in the confined space. "Boot prints in the dust. See how clear they are. This passage has not been used regularly. The dust tells us that. These prints are recent. Within the last few days, certainly." Watson crouched beside him, studying the marks. They were distinct, showing the pattern of a sole, the wear on the heel. Not a servant's simple boot, but something better made, with a heel that suggested a gentleman's footwear. The prints led from the library entrance, down the steps, into darkness. "2 sets," Holmes continued, his finger tracing the path without touching. "One moving down into the passage, another returning, ascending back toward the library. The same boots, I believe. Note the distinctive wear pattern on the right heel, visible in both directions. Someone came down from the library, then returned the same way." "After killing Ashford," Watson said quietly. "After attending to business in the library, at any rate." Holmes stood, brushing dust from his knees. "But there is something else. Look at the shelf mechanism itself, Watson. Here, where the book spine connects to the latch." Watson leaned closer, holding his own candle near the mechanism Holmes indicated. It was elegantly simple. The book's spine, when pulled, drew back a metal rod that released a catch, allowing the shelf to swing on hidden hinges. The metal showed age, dark with oxidation, but in one spot it gleamed slightly, as though recently cleaned or handled. "Someone oiled this," Holmes said. "See? Fresh oil, applied within the last week. The mechanism is centuries old, yet it moves smoothly, silently. Someone prepared it, Watson. Someone wanted to ensure it would work without noise or hesitation when the moment came." "Miss Casterbrook discovered the passage 2 days before the murder," Watson said. "But she wouldn't have known to oil the mechanism. She was excited, impulsive. She would have used it as she found it." "Exactly. Which means someone else came here after her discovery. Someone who understood that mechanisms unused for decades require preparation. Someone methodical, careful, who planned each step." Holmes closed the shelf from inside, demonstrating how the handle worked, then opened it again. The oil is on both sides, accessible from the library and from within the passage. The murderer could have prepared the mechanism from either direction. They descended the steps, following the bootprints down through stone that had been cut during Elizabeth's reign, when England's Catholics had needed places to hide from raids and recusancy laws, when architecture had been pressed into service of survival. The steps turned in their spiral, and Watson counted again, 23, each worn smooth by feet long dead, feet that had climbed in fear or faith, or simply the routine passage of servants using a shortcut their masters had forgotten existed. The small chamber at the bottom showed more evidence of recent passage. The dust here was disturbed in patterns that suggested someone had waited, perhaps crouched against the wall, listening. Holmes examined the 3 passages that led from this space, his candle illuminating each in turn. The central passage to the wine cellar, most disturbed, he observed. But look at the right-hand passage. Less disturbed, but not untouched. Someone explored it as well. Where does it lead? Watson asked. Let us see. Holmes entered the right-hand passage, stooping under the low ceiling, his candle flame bending in the slight draught that moved through these hidden spaces. Watson followed, feeling the walls press close, the weight of the house above seeming to increase with each step. The passage ran straight for perhaps 20 feet, then turned sharply left, then right again, following the manor's foundations in a path that made no sense until Watson realized it was designed to avoid the cellar's supporting pillars. They emerged quite suddenly into another small chamber, this one different from the first. It was larger, perhaps 10 feet square, and its walls showed the remains of old shelving, wooden brackets still attached to stone, rotted planks lying on the floor. A second priest hole, Watson realized, or perhaps a storage space for the priests who had hidden here. A place to keep vestments and sacred vessels when saying Mass meant treason. Look at this, Holmes said, his attention fixed on something in the corner. He knelt, and Watson saw what had caught his eye, a scrap of cloth, dark wool, caught on one of the old shelf brackets. Holmes freed it carefully, holding it to his candlelight. Gentleman's coat, he said. Quality weaving. Recently torn within the last few days. The threads are still intact, not yet frayed by time or handling. He stood, turning slowly, his candle illuminating the chamber's walls. Someone came through here, someone wearing a gentleman's coat, moving quickly enough to catch it on that bracket. But why come this way? The central passage to the wine cellar is more direct. Watson thought about it, working through the geometry of the house in his mind. This passage, where does it emerge? Holmes smiled slightly, that expression that meant Watson had asked the right question. Let us discover that together. A third passage led from this chamber, smaller still, requiring them to move bent, nearly double. The air grew damper, colder, carrying the smell of earth and stone and something organic, roots, perhaps, or fungi, growing in darkness. After perhaps 30 feet, the passage began to slope upward, and then they saw light ahead. Not candlelight, but the grey light of evening filtering through something above them. They emerged through a trap door hidden beneath a wooden bench in what Watson recognized as the estate's chapel, a small stone building separate from the main house, used for private worship by the family and their guests. The bench was old, its wood dark with age, positioned against the chapel's eastern wall. The trapdoor beneath it was so well fitted that Watson doubted anyone would notice it, unless they knew to look. "A second escape route," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying strangely in the chapel's acoustics. "If the priest hole was discovered, if soldiers searched the wine cellar, there was always this, a passage to consecrated ground, to a place where arrest became complicated by sanctuary laws, where the church's authority might protect when the crowns threatened." Watson looked around the chapel, seeing it with new eyes. The pews held perhaps 40 people. The altar was simple, Anglo-Catholic in its decoration, with candles and a cross and embroidered cloths. Windows of stained glass showed saints in their traditional poses. George with his dragon, Christopher with his staff, Michael with his sword. Evening light through coloured glass cast pools of blue and red and gold across the stone floor. "Someone used this route," Holmes continued. "Someone who knew about both passages, who understood that the direct route through the wine cellar might be observed. Servants work in wine cellars, after all, even in the evening. But this route, through the forgotten chamber and up into the chapel, would be entirely private." "But why?" Watson asked. "If the murderer's goal was to reach the library unseen, kill Ashford and return, the wine cellar route would suffice. Why explore this alternate path?" "Because murderers, like generals, prefer to have multiple escape routes," Holmes replied. "Or because someone was testing the passages, learning their geography, preparing options." He moved to the chapel door and opened it carefully, looking out at the grounds. The chapel stood, perhaps 50 yards from the main house, connected by a gravel path that curved through gardens. Anyone walking from house to chapel would be visible from multiple windows, but in darkness, or in the distraction of a house party's social obligations, such movement might pass unnoticed. They returned through the passage, through the hidden chamber with its rotted shelves and scrap of torn wool, through the central chamber where someone had waited and listened, up the spiral steps into the priest hole, and finally back into the library itself. Holmes closed the shelf mechanism behind them and stood for a moment, his eyes moving across the room as though reading a text written in objects and spaces rather than words. "The bookmark," he said suddenly, moving to the reading table where he had left it earlier. He picked it up, turning it in the lamplight. C.A. Cornelius Ashford's monogram. But why was it on the floor? What was it marking? Watson watched as Holmes examined the books on the reading table, the Psalter still open to its illuminated page, the ledger of estate records, the notebook with Ashford's annotations. None of them showed any sign of having recently held a bookmark. "It wasn't marking his place in a book," Watson said slowly. "It was marking something else." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Continue." "It was a signal, perhaps? Or evidence he was trying to preserve? Something he grabbed when he realized he was in danger?" Watson felt he was reaching, grasping at possibilities without full understanding. "Or," Holmes said quietly, "it was planted. Think, Watson. The murderer strikes from behind. Ashford never sees his assailant, never has time to reach for anything. The blow kills quickly, efficiently. But afterward, the murderer needs to arrange the scene, needs to create the locked room puzzle, needs to make it seem impossible. Part of that arrangement might include scattering Ashford's possessions in ways that suggest struggle, or search, or simple, tragic accident. He moved to where the body had lain, marked now only by chalk outlines the constable had drawn before the body was removed. Ashford wore his spectacles. We know this from the marks on his nose. Yet they were found on the table, carefully folded. Who folds spectacles carefully after receiving a fatal blow to the head? The murderer, Watson said, taking them off, folding them, placing them just so. Creating a scene, Holmes agreed, and in creating that scene, perhaps dropping the bookmark or placing it deliberately, one more detail in the tableau of mysterious death. But here is the interesting thing, Watson. The bookmark was gripped too hard, its corner bent. That's not careful staging. That's... He paused, thinking. That's nerves. The murderer was nervous, despite the planning, despite the preparation. Gripped the bookmark too tightly while arranging it, bent it without meaning to. Watson felt something click into place in his understanding. Someone methodical enough to oil mechanisms and plan escape routes, but nervous enough to bend a bookmark. Someone who had never killed before. Exactly. Holmes set the bookmark down with care, which tells us something important about our murderer's state of mind. This was not casual violence. This was desperate necessity, executed by someone who found the act abhorrent even as they committed it. The room had grown darker as they talked, evening sliding into night, the lamp's glow creating islands of light in gathering shadow. Outside, Watson could hear the sounds of the house preparing for dinner, distant voices, footsteps on stairs, the clatter of dishes being set. Life continuing its patterns, even as they stood in the room where death had interrupted those patterns so violently. We have method and motive, Watson said. We know Thorne knew about the passage, knew his reputation was about to be destroyed. We have boot prints and torn cloth and oiled mechanisms. Surely that's enough to accuse him. Holmes moved to the window, looking out at darkness. Tomorrow, he said quietly. Tomorrow we shall bring everyone together and demonstrate what happened. But tonight, Watson, I want you to do something for me. I want you to watch Mr. Thorne. Observe him at dinner, in the drawing room afterward. Watch for signs of a man under strain, a man who has done something he can never undo. Watch and tell me what you see. Dinner that evening was a peculiar exercise in Victorian propriety, stretched to its breaking point. The dining room gleamed with silver and crystal, candles reflecting in polished mahogany, while around the table sat people who maintained the forms of civilization even as murder sat among them like an uninvited guest. Watson, positioned where Holmes had suggested, had a clear view of Mr. Reginald Thorne, and what he saw troubled him deeply. Thorne ate nothing. His knife and fork moved food around his plate in patterns that suggested routine rather than appetite, cutting and arranging without ever lifting anything to his mouth. His wineglass remained full, though Watson saw him reach for it repeatedly, his hand stopping halfway, then returning to his lap. When Lady Caroline addressed him with some pleasantry about the weather improving, he startled visibly before composing his features into something approaching a smile and offering a reply Watson could not quite hear. But it was Thorne's hands that Watson found most telling. They trembled, not constantly, but in moments when Thorne thought no one was watching, when his attention drifted from the effort of maintaining composure. The hands of a man who had done something his hands remembered, even as his mind tried to forget. Holmes, seated across the table, maintained a flow of light conversation with Lady Ashworth about London's theatre season, seemingly unconcerned with the investigation that Watson knew occupied every corner of his thoughts. It was a performance, Watson realized, designed to lower guard, to make Thorne believe the matter was not yet urgent, that there was still time, still possibility of escape or denial. After dinner, the company moved to the drawing-room, that ritual migration through corridors lit by gas lamps that hissed softly, past portraits of Ashworth ancestors who watched with the calm judgment of the long dead. The drawing-room fire had been built up against the evening chill, and the warmth combined with wine and exhaustion created an atmosphere of drowsy unreality, as though they were all players in a drama whose final act had not yet been written. Holmes waited until coffee had been served, until the usual post-dinner settling had occurred. Lady Caroline at her embroidery, Sir Geoffrey with his newspaper, the Reverend Blackwood reading quietly in a corner chair. Then he stood, moving to the fireplace with the casual authority of a man about to tell a story, and every eye in the room turned to him. "I believe," he said quietly, "that I can now explain how Cornelius Ashford died in a locked room, and more importantly, I believe I can explain why." The room stilled. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, as though the house itself was listening. "The locked room," Holmes continued, "has fascinated minds for centuries. It represents impossibility, the violation of physical law, and therefore we reach for supernatural explanations, ghosts, curses, divine intervention. Blackwell Manor has a history that encourages such thinking. Built during Catholic persecutions, haunted by stories of hidden priests and midnight masses, possessed of an atmosphere that suggests secrets. The murderer understood this, counted on it. By creating an impossible death, the murderer invited you all to think of impossibilities rather than mundane mechanisms." He gestured toward the ceiling, toward the library above them. But there was nothing impossible about what occurred. The library has one door, yes, but it also has another entrance, one built 400 years ago when entrance and exit served different purposes than they do now. A priest hole, accessed by pulling a specific book spine, leading down through the house's foundations to the wine cellar and beyond. Miss Casterbrook discovered this passage 2 days before Ashford's death, and she mentioned it to someone who immediately understood what opportunity it represented. Watson watched Thorne's face, saw the colour drain from it, like water from a broken vessel. "The manuscript," Holmes said, his voice remaining gentle, conversational, as though discussing ancient history rather than recent murder. Geoffrey of Monmouth, or so it was claimed. A discovery worth £40,000, worth academic immortality, worth building one's entire reputation upon. Except it was a forgery. Not a crude forgery. No, this was work of considerable skill, perhaps even genius. Someone understood medieval manuscripts well enough to create something nearly perfect. Nearly, but not quite. He moved to a side table where he had earlier placed Ashford's folder of notes. Prussian blue. A pigment invented in 1706, 5.5 centuries after Geoffrey of Monmouth died. It appears in the ink used to write the manuscript, invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable under chemical analysis. Miss Casterbrook performed that analysis. Mr. Ashford verified it. And on the night he died, Ashford was preparing to announce these findings publicly, in front of witnesses, with evidence that could not be disputed. Lord Ashworth leaned forward, Who made the forgery? Who sold it to Mr. Thorne? Those questions may never be answered fully, Holmes replied. The dealer is conveniently dead, the provenance conveniently vague. What matters for our purposes is what Mr. Thorne knew, and when he knew it. And I believe Mr. Thorne knew nothing until Miss Casterbrook's innocent enthusiasm revealed both the manuscript's fraudulent nature and the house's hidden passages. All eyes turned to Thorne now. He sat very still, his hands gripped together in his lap, his face expressionless, in the way of a man who has rehearsed this moment and found his lines inadequate. Picture the situation, Holmes continued. A man has invested not just money, but identity in a discovery. He has published, lectured, accepted congratulations and admiration. He has donated the manuscript to Lord Ashworth's collection, with conditions ensuring his name will forever be associated with it. And then he learns, days before a public presentation, that everything is false, that he will be revealed as either a fool or a fraud, that his reputation will be destroyed, his investment lost, his name synonymous with the greatest manuscript fraud of the age. Watson saw Thorne's jaw tighten, saw the muscle jump beneath the skin. Most men, Holmes said quietly, would have fled, would have claimed illness, made excuses, left before the revelation occurred. But Mr. Thorne is not most men. He has spent his life in commerce, in negotiation, in finding solutions to impossible problems. And Miss Casterbrook, in her enthusiasm, had shown him a solution. A locked room, death. An impossible murder that would delay everything. That would perhaps make Ashford's findings seem questionable. That would at minimum buy time to think, to plan, to somehow salvage what could be salvaged. Holmes moved to stand directly before Thorne's chair. On the evening of Ashford's death, you retired to your room at 10:30. Your room in the eastern wing, near the servant corridors. You waited until the household had settled, until the guests were occupied in the drawing room and billiard room, until the servants were attending to their duties. Then you slipped out, made your way to the chapel. The chapel, Mr. Thorne, not the wine cellar, because the chapel route was more private, less likely to encounter servants. You had explored both passages after Miss Casterbrook told you about them. You had prepared the mechanism, oiling it so it would move silently. You had planned each step. Thorne's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. You climbed up through the trap door in the chapel, followed the passage through the hidden chamber, where you tore your coat on an old shelf bracket, through the central chamber, up the spiral steps, into the priest hole. You pulled the book spine from inside, opened the shelf mechanism, and stepped into the library, where Cornelius Ashford sat working at his table, his back to you, absorbed in his notes, preparing the presentation that would destroy you. The drawing room was utterly silent now, except for the fire's soft crackling and the distant tick of a clock in the hall. You struck him, Holmes said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. A single blow to the back of the head with something heavy. The brass candlestick from the library mantel, I believe, later cleaned and returned to its place. The blow killed him quickly. He may not have even known what happened. And then you began to arrange the scene. You removed his spectacles, folded them carefully, placed them on the table. You scattered some of his papers to suggest he had been working normally. You took his bookmark, his monogrammed bookmark that would clearly belong to him, and dropped it on the floor, gripping it too tightly in your nervousness, bending its corner. Thorne's hands were shaking visibly now. The tremor Watson had observed at dinner intensified beyond any hope of concealment. "You took the key from Ashford's pocket and locked the door from inside, then replaced the key in his pocket to create the locked room puzzle. Then you retreated through the priest hole, pulled the book spine to close the shelf behind you, descended the steps, retraced your path through the passages and chapel, and returned to your room. The entire excursion might have taken 20 minutes. No one saw you leave. No one saw you return. And when Lord Ashworth discovered the body an hour later, you were safely in your room, apparently having been there all evening." "This is speculation," Sir Geoffrey said, his magistrate's voice seeking firm ground. "You have no proof of any of this." "Don't I?" Holmes gestured to Watson. "Dr. Watson observed Mr. Thorne carefully this evening, and can testify to signs of extreme nervous strain consistent with a man who has recently committed an act of violence. But beyond observation, we have physical evidence. The boot prints in the priest hole match Mr. Thorne's boots. You can verify this, Sir Geoffrey, by comparing them. The scrap of wool caught on the shelf bracket came from Mr. Thorne's dinner coat, the same coat he is wearing now, which shows a small tear at the elbow that precisely matches the fabric sample. Watson saw Thorne's hand move involuntarily to his elbow, touching the place where his coat had torn. But most damningly, Holmes continued, we have this." He reached into his pocket and produced the dark blue silk ribbon found in the priest hole. Miss Casterbrook's ribbon, lost when she explored the passages 2 days before the murder. She told you about the passages, Mr. Thorne. You encountered her emerging from the wine cellar, remember? She was excited, wanted to share her discovery. And after she told you, you went exploring yourself. You found this ribbon in the priest hole, and you kept it. Why would I keep it? Thorne's voice was hoarse, the first words he had spoken since Holmes began. "Because it implicated Miss Casterbrook," Holmes said gently. "Because, if the worst happened, if you were suspected, you could produce this ribbon and suggest that she was the one who used the passages, that she killed Ashford in jealous rage or academic rivalry or any of a dozen motives. You kept it as insurance, Mr. Thorne. But insurance only works if you're willing to use it, and I don't believe you are. I don't believe you could watch an innocent woman hang for your crime." Thorne stood abruptly, the movement jerky and uncontrolled. For a moment, Watson thought he might run, might attempt some desperate flight. But instead he simply stood there, swaying slightly, his face working through expressions that cascaded from denial to anger to something that looked almost like relief. "He was going to destroy me," Thorne said, his voice breaking. "Everything I had built, everything I had become, all of it would have been ash. Can you understand that? Can any of you understand what it means to face complete annihilation of self?" "I understand desperation," Holmes said quietly. "I understand that men do terrible things when they believe they have no choice. But you did have choices, Mr. Thorne. You could have withdrawn the manuscript, claimed you had been deceived, accepted the financial loss and the embarrassment. Your reputation would have suffered, certainly, but you would have survived it. Instead, you chose murder, and that choice, once made, cannot be unmade." Thorne looked around the room, at faces that showed varying degrees of shock and condemnation, and, in some cases, pity. His gaze stopped on Miss Casterbrook, who sat very straight in her chair, her face pale but composed. "I'm sorry," he said to her. I'm sorry I would have let you take the blame. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to face what I had done." He turned to Sir Geoffrey, drawing himself up with some effort at dignity. "I imagine you'll want to place me under arrest. I won't resist. I won't run. What would be the point? Mr. Holmes has made it quite clear that running only delays the inevitable." "Sir." Geoffrey stood, his magistrate's authority reasserting itself now that the case was clear. "Reginald Thorne, I am placing you in custody for the murder of Cornelius Ashford. You will remain confined to this house under guard until arrangements can be made to transport you to the county jail. Have you anything else to say?" Thorne was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, as though looking at something far away. "The manuscript truly was beautiful," he said finally. "Whatever else was false about it, whoever made it was an artist. I wish I could have known them. I wish I could have understood why they created something so perfect and then sold it into fraud. Perhaps they needed money. Perhaps they were bitter at the academy that never recognized their talents. Perhaps they simply wanted to prove they could fool the experts. I'll never know now. That's what haunts me most, not the murder, though God knows that should haunt me enough, but the knowledge that somewhere there's an artist of genius whose name will never be known, whose work will be destroyed or locked away as evidence of fraud, whose talent will be remembered only as criminality. It was, Watson thought, a strange epitaph for a murder, regret not for the life taken, but for the art that had precipitated the taking. But perhaps that was the truest measure of Reginald Thorne, a man who had valued reputation over life, beauty over truth, and finally discovered that such valuations carried prices he could not afford to pay. The train back to London moved through countryside that seemed determined to erase the memory of storm, as though the violence of that night at Blackwell Manor had exhausted the sky's capacity for drama. Pale sunlight filtered through clouds that hung thin and high, casting no shadows worth noting, and the fields rolling past the carriage window showed the orderly green of England in late autumn, hedgerows dividing the land into parcels that spoke of centuries of careful cultivation and possession. Watson sat by the window, watching the landscape transform gradually from rural to suburban to urban, the steady encroachment of brick and smoke that meant London approaching. Across from him, Holmes sat with his eyes closed, though Watson knew he was not sleeping, but rather thinking, arranging the case's elements in his mind the way a librarian might reshelve books after a period of consultation. Everything returned to its proper place. The disorder of investigation resolved into the order of solution. The leather bookmark lay on the seat between them, still bearing its bent corner, that small imperfection that had helped unravel everything. Holmes had asked Lord Ashworth if he might keep it, and Lord Ashworth had agreed readily, perhaps glad to have one fewer reminder of tragedy in his house. Watson found himself looking at it periodically, at the monogram C.A. worked in gold thread, at the silk ribbon attached that had once marked places in medieval manuscripts, and now marked only memory. "You're thinking about Miss Casterbrook," Holmes said without opening his eyes. Watson smiled slightly. His friend's capacity for deduction extended even to the quality of silence in a railway carriage. "I am. She blames herself. However much you told her otherwise, she believes she armed a murderer with knowledge." "She did arm him," Holmes replied, opening his eyes now, his gaze steady and direct. But knowledge is not inherently weapon or tool. It becomes one or the other through use. Miss Casterbrook shared a discovery with the enthusiasm of a scholar who had found something wonderful. That Thorne weaponized that information speaks to his character, not hers. Will she recover from it, do you think? Holmes considered this, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. She is young, brilliant, and possessed of a conscience. That combination suggests she will carry this as a scar rather than a wound, something that shaped her but did not destroy her. I suspect she will become more careful in her enthusiasms, more aware of how information travels and transforms. Whether that makes her a better scholar or simply a sadder one, only time will tell. The train's rhythm changed as it began to slow, entering London's outskirts, passing through Clapham and Brixton, neighbourhoods Watson knew by their church spires and the particular arrangements of their streets. The afternoon was drawing toward evening, and already gas lamps were being lit in windows, creating that peculiar twilight warmth that made London feel like home after days in the country, no matter how grand the country house had been. The manuscript will be destroyed, I suppose, Watson said, burned as evidence of fraud. Likely, though I wonder if Lord Ashworth might preserve it as a curiosity, a lesson in the limits of expertise and the power of skillful forgery. It belongs in a museum, really, labelled honestly as what it is, a masterwork of deception, valuable precisely because it so thoroughly fooled those who should have known better. Holmes pulled the case file from his travelling bag, the folder of Ashford's notes that he had kept as reference. Ashford's analysis will be published posthumously, I imagine. Dr. Fielding seemed eager to see his colleague's work receive proper credit. The irony, of course, is that Ashford's greatest discovery will now be forever associated with the murder it caused. His name and Thorne's bound together in a way neither would have chosen. Watson thought about Cornelius Ashford, whom he had never met alive, knew only as a chalk outline on a library floor and a collection of precise notes in careful handwriting. A man who had loved truth enough to die for it, though he hadn't known that was the price truth would demand. A man who had been, by Miss Casterbrook's account, not particularly kind, but undeniably brilliant. Watson had seen enough of death to know that it rarely came for people in ways that suited their characters. The kind died violently, the violent peacefully, and the brilliant sometimes died for being too clever at inopportune moments. Did Thorne know he would be caught? Watson asked. When he planned it, did he understand that the locked room puzzle would draw attention rather than deflect it? I think he hoped for confusion, Holmes replied. Hoped that impossibility would create such a tangle of speculation and supernatural theorizing that the actual mechanism would remain hidden. He nearly succeeded. If Miss Casterbrook hadn't told me about finding the ribbon, if the architectural records hadn't been preserved so meticulously, if the murderer hadn't been nervous enough to bend a bookmark, any one of those variables changing might have left us with an unsolved mystery, a death that became legend rather than case law. The train pulled into Victoria Station with a hiss of steam and the screech of brakes, the platform outside suddenly visible through, windows now speckled with the first drops of evening rain. London weather, Watson thought, reliable in its unreliability, welcoming them home with damp and noise and the immediate press of humanity that felt both exhausting and comforting after the isolated grandeur of Blackwell Manor. They gathered their bags and stepped onto the platform, into air that smelled of coal smoke and rain-wet stone, and the 1,000 daily dinners being cooked in 1,000 nearby homes. A hansom cab waited at the station's entrance, and Holmes gave the driver their Baker Street address, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been away precisely long enough to appreciate returning. The journey through London's evening streets was its own kind of meditation. They passed shops closing for the night, their proprietors pulling down shutters and counting the day's receipts. They passed public houses just opening, light and sound spilling onto pavements where workers gathered to spend a portion of their wages on the warmth and fellowship that made labour bearable. They passed hospitals and churches, constables on their beats, and flower sellers packing up their unsold inventory, and all of it felt real in a way that Blackwell Manor, for all its history and tragedy, had not quite managed. Baker Street, when they reached it, looked exactly as they had left it 3 days prior. The familiar door, the familiar windows showing Mrs. Hudson's light in the ground floor rooms, the familiar sense of having arrived where one belonged. Holmes paid the cab driver, and they climbed the 17 steps to their rooms. Steps Watson had climbed so many times he no longer counted them consciously, though his body knew their rhythm like a heartbeat. Mrs. Hudson had prepared tea and left it warming by the fire, along with a plate of biscuits and a note saying she was glad they were home safe and hoped they had solved their mystery satisfactorily. The rooms smelled of tea and coal fire and the particular mustiness of papers and chemical experiments, and Watson sank into his chair with a sigh that came from deeper than mere physical tiredness. Holmes remained standing for a moment, moving to the window to look out at Baker Street's evening bustle, his silhouette dark against the gaslight glow. Then he turned, and Watson saw in his friend's face something he recognized. The satisfaction of a puzzle solved combined with the slight melancholy that came when a case's solution revealed more sadness than triumph. "Thorn will hang," Holmes said quietly. Sir Geoffrey was quite clear about that. Premeditated murder, committed with planning and forethought. No possibility of self-defense or accident. The trial will be brief, the verdict certain. "Do you pity him?" Watson asked. "I pity the waste," Holmes replied. "A life spent building reputation, ended by desperate attempt to preserve it. If Thorn had possessed the courage to face humiliation, he might have rebuilt. Men survive disgrace. Watson, they survive bankruptcy and exposure and the collapse of carefully constructed identities. What they cannot survive is the decision to preserve those identities through murder. That decision transforms everything that came before into prologue to crime." Watson reached for his journal, the battered leather notebook, where he recorded the cases that seemed worth preserving, worth shaping into narratives that might interest the reading public. He opened to a fresh page and wrote the date, then paused, pen hovering over paper. "What will you call this one?" Holmes asked, a slight smile touching his features. "The Adventure of the Locked Library? The Case of the Forged Manuscript?" "The Library with One Door," Watson said, writing the title as he spoke it. "Because that was the puzzle, wasn't it? A room with one door that everyone watched, while the real entrances and exits lay hidden behind centuries and books and the blind spots of social certainty." He wrote steadily for a few minutes, capturing the essential details while they were fresh. The storm-wet grounds, the impossible locked room, the bookmark's bent corner, the priest hole's darkness, Thorn's trembling hands at dinner. The words came easily, shaped by the narrative structure he had developed over years of chronicling Holmes's investigations, and he felt the peculiar satisfaction that came from transforming experience into record, from ensuring that what had happened would not be entirely lost to time's erosion. Holmes settled into his own chair, pulling out his pipe and tobacco, beginning the familiar ritual of packing and lighting that meant he was transitioning from investigation into reflection. The fire crackled softly, rain began to tap more insistently against the windows, and somewhere below Mrs. Hudson moved through her evening routines, the sounds of domesticity rising like incense through the floors. "Do you think the forger knew?" Watson asked suddenly. "Whoever created that manuscript. Do you think they imagined their work would lead to murder?" Holmes exhaled smoke, watching it curl toward the ceiling. Artists rarely imagine the full consequences of their art. They create from compulsion or necessity, or the simple desire to prove they can do what others believe impossible. The forger wanted to fool experts, perhaps wanted to reveal later that they had done so, to embarrass the academy that may have rejected them. They could not have anticipated that their creation would become so valuable, would carry such weight of reputation and fortune that someone would kill to preserve the illusion of its authenticity. "Another kind of locked room," Watson murmured, "the forger locked in anonymity, unable to claim credit for their masterwork because doing so would mean admitting fraud." "Exactly." Holmes smiled, the expression both sad and appreciative. "Secrets have costs, Watson. The priest hole kept Catholics safe, but also kept them hidden, isolated from full participation in their country's life. The manuscript kept its maker anonymous, but also kept their genius from recognition. And Ashworth's death kept Thorne's reputation intact for perhaps 3 days before destroying it utterly. Every locked room is also a prison, whether we recognize it immediately or not." Watson wrote this observation in his journal, knowing it would serve as the story's closing meditation, the thematic weight that might transform mere mystery into something more resonant. He wrote about the journey home, about London's welcoming damp, about the comfort of familiar rooms and the satisfaction of puzzles solved. And finally, he wrote about the bookmark, still lying on the table between their chairs, and what it represented. Not just evidence, but memorial. Reminder that truth demands its prices, and those prices are not always paid by those who seek it. Outside, London continued its evening rituals, indifferent to one murder solved among so many daily dramas. Inside, Holmes and Watson sat in comfortable silence, the fire burning down, the tea growing cold, the rain intensifying into one of those autumn downpours that would drench the city and leave it cleaner, at least temporarily, washed of some small portion of its accumulated grime and guilt. "Until the next case finds us," Watson said finally, closing his journal. "Until then," Holmes agreed. "Sleep well, Watson. We've earned it." And in the warmth of Baker Street, with rain drumming against windows and the city's endless murmur providing backdrop, they rested. 2 men who had travelled to Oxfordshire and back, who had solved a locked room and caught a murderer, who had done the work they were meant to do, and could now, for a brief while, simply be. The story, like the storm, had passed. What remained was memory, record, and the quiet satisfaction of truth restored to light.